Most High put together. We gon' see. In times.
Serpents lurking, watchers watching, y'all sure I'll stay on point. They lurking. We under the covenant, we ain't got no other choice. Gird your loins up, armor up, cause it's time for war. We the generation that's gon' get on one accord. Serpents lurking, watchers watching, y'all sure I'll stay on point.
Got real
We
now.
under the covenant, we ain't got no other choice. Gird your loins up, armor up, cause it's time for war.
All right, so here are some sources here that you should take note of. It says Professor Rollin B. Dixon, an anthropologist from Harvard University, in his study of the physical characteristics of the Ashanti, notes a similarity to the Chad group of people in the Sudan. The Sudanese Republic is in the northeastern section of Africa near Egypt and Ethiopia. The black immigration, he adds, was in a part of a westerly drift from the Chad-Nile area and in part a direct southward movement from the western Sudan and the Sahara's border, forced by the expansion in the Sahara region of the Caucasian peoples who have poured into northern Africa since very early times. Also, Dr. Hermann Brauman of the State Museum of Anthropology in Berlin, West Germany, concludes that the Ashanti are to be classified with the strongly Sudanese Yoruba and I want to say Nupe. The historian Walter Claridge, in a book about the history of Ghana and the Ashanti, concludes that the Fantis, Ashantis, Wasawa, and in fact all the Twi-speaking or Akan peoples were originally one tribe. In summary, we find the following general observations made by Professor Williams and other leading scholars about the African origins of the Ashanti. The Ashanti are an ethnic mixture of the peoples of West Africa, the ancestral home of most Black Americans. And this is what I saw on my DNA results as well. It says the Ashanti are closely related to the Bantu, Yoruba, Fanti, Sudanese, and other people whose combined population stretches from the west to the east coast of Africa, mainly below the Sahara. All right, so we're focusing primarily on the Ashanti right now, but don't miss this, because there is a connection to us here in the United States. It says, the Ashanti tribes appear to have migrated and later pushed westward and southward by alien invaders of European origin. All right, it says, the question still remains whether the earlier Ashanti are related peoples have any connection with the Hebrews of the Middle East. The answer which Professor Williams reaches is that the similarities, which are too great to ignore, can be accounted for only by the fact that somewhere in the remote past there was an infiltration of the ancient Hebrews in the parent stock from which the present Ashanti evolved. In fact, it was the continuous influx of Hebrew settlers trekking up the Nile, which he says eventually spread itself clear across Africa to the Niger River, and thence pretty much over the whole of West Africa. He goes on to say, there is no doubt in the mind of Professor Williams that the Ashanti are infused with the blood and culture of earlier Hebrews who migrated from the Middle East. If you remember, Abraham started in Arabia. All right, it says, nor is there any doubt that these same Ashantis are related today to virtually every tribal grouping in Black West Africa. The evidence, according to Professor Williams, is cumulative and revealed by the many striking parallels between the civilization of Black West Africa and the Hebrew Middle East, and it is reinforced, as we shall say, by similar resemblances throughout the rest of Black Africa as well. So I want you to take a look at this picture, because this is the picture that will be referenced in the next part that I'm going to read. And the title is Ashanti Ambassadors Crossing the Pra. And this is from a drawing by Sir Henry Morton Stanley. So they are really talking about this man sitting right here. They're going to be focusing on this turban and what he's wearing right here across his chest. So let's get going with that. All right, so they are referring to him as the Ashanti representatives as I go through this. So the illustration worn by the Ashanti representative, at first glance, says Professor Williams, this would appear to be unquestionably a vestige of the high priest of the Hebrews, but it is well to remember that Professor Clay observes that the breastplate was not peculiar to the Hebrews. It was to be found as well in Egypt and probably elsewhere. However, the divisions of the breastplate into 12 parts is certainly distinctive as a Hebrew symbol. According to Dr. T. Edward Bowditch, perhaps the first contemporary European to come into close contact with the Ashanti, says, one curious evidence may be added to the former identification of the Ashanti nations. It is the tradition that the whole of these people were originally comprehended into 12 tribes or families in which they classify themselves still. All right, I'm going to drop down. It says Professor A.B. Ellis, in a book written almost 1/2 century later in 1881, relates that the Ashanti representatives pointed to the gold plates on their breasts as being their insignia of office. When asked by the British official of the Gold Coast for evidence of their authority, don't miss that. All right, going on, it says, besides the breastplate, the illustration shows another highly revealing symbol, which links the Ashanti directly to the Hebrews. Williams note that the headdress of the herald or representative with its gold disc in front satisfies the description of the Hebrew miznefit. I'm hoping I'm saying that right. The miznefit is described in the Jewish Encyclopedia as a tiara, or perhaps a peculiarly wound turban with a peak, the front of which bore a gold plate with the inscription, Holy unto Yahweh. Now, isn't that proof enough? But let's keep going. All right, now this portion that I'm going to read is taken directly from the book Hebrewisms of West Africa, page 93. It says, all ethnologists agree that the Negro tribes are essentially a conglomeration of stocks, good, bad, and indifferent. E.D. Morel illustrates this well when he speaks of that portion of Western Central Africa now known as Northern Nigeria as follows. In the course of ages, through the influence of Moorish, Semitic, and probably pre-Semitic Egyptian culture fused in later times with Mohammedan law, learning, and religion, there has been evolved in this region a civilization combining a curious mixture of Africa and the East. And again, speaking of Kano between Bornu and Sokoto, he calls it the most interesting region in all the dark continent, where diverse races have ceaselessly intermingled. So all of the dark races were mingling with each other, attracted thither by its fertile soil and abundant pastures, Libyan and Berber, Egyptian and Semite, and the mysterious Fulani. The most that we can hope to establish then is a strong infiltration of Hebrew stock in certain tribes or areas with a possible explanation of the source of influence. Even those colonies of Jews, which are of comparatively recent foundation in Africa, have for the most part deteriorated completely from the ideals of their race and their religion. Let's keep going. All right, so taking a look at my results, you can see it's 98.5% sub-Saharan African and 79.7% West African, and then they show you where they're getting the percentages for that West African population. So it would include Ghanaian, Liberian, Sierra Leone at 35.5%, Nigerian at 26.4%, Senegambian and Guinean 5.7%, and it's broadly West African, which is just showing the diversity of the West Africans in that area. Then Congolese, Southern East African at 18.3%, and then the Angolan and Congolese at 18.0%. And again, that broadly Congolese and Southern East African, that mixture again at 0.3%, and just broadly sub-Saharan African at 0.5%. All right, let's keep going. So I'm going to share this article from the Jewish Virtual Library, and you will hear some of the places I just named in my results listed here. The title is Zimbabwe's Black Jews, the Lemba people. Rusape is located in the northeast Zimbabwe, about 120 miles from Harare. The community claims both an ancient and modern Jewish heritage. The Jews of Rusape, believed to be the descendants of one of the lost tribes of Jacob. These people are believed to be offspring from the Bantu people who came from northern Africa. Almost 2,500 years ago, after the destruction of the temple, talking about the destruction at Jerusalem, a group of Jews left Judea and settled in Yemen. When the economic situation in Yemen began to fail, the Jews left and moved to Africa, with one group settling in Ethiopia and the other in Tanzania. After several years, many Jews left Ethiopia and moved further south into what is today Zimbabwe. They became known as the Lemba. Today, there exists a Lemba Cultural Association attempting to bring all the various Lemba communities in South Africa, Mozambique, Ethiopia, and Zimbabwe together.
Among the peoples of Southern Africa, an extraordinary group stands out. They're called the Lemba, or the Black Jews. They trace their origins back not to ancestors on this continent, but rather to a people who lived in the land of Israel thousands of years ago. But what makes them even more remarkable is their assertion that when they came into Africa, they also brought with them possibly the most sought-after object in human history, the fabled Ark of the Covenant, the Ark that stood in the temple in Jerusalem and which vanished without a trace 2.5 millennia ago.
If you touch it, you die instantly.
Nobody but the priest was allowed to touch it. If they did, they were dead.
Perhaps they have the Ark of the Covenant.
It belongs to us.
Ever since he was a young boy, Joe Rawlinga believed he was different. He heard that around the fires where he grew up in the Limpopo province of South Africa. He was taught that he was a Lemba.
The Lemba people in Southern Africa in particular are connected to the Jewish people in Israel. And therefore, we have got Jewish blood as the Southern African Lembas.
Today, Joe Rawlinga is a judge in the Pretoria High Court. The Lemba live among other black groups like the Venda and speak their languages, but they maintain their origins do not lie in Africa.
I mean, as I grew up, we were told that we traveled from Judea, settled in Yemen for quite a number of years. Then we crossed into Africa. And of course, that is why we're called Lemba. Although we're black Jews, but immediately we entered Africa, then we're known as the Lemba.
The Lemba is a group with a very strong cultural identity and practices unlike that of other groups around them.
They maintain traditions which are significantly different from the traditions respected by most of the tribes in Central and Southern Africa.
Tudor Parfitt is a historian who has devoted his life to studying Judaizing groups all over the world. He's associated with the School for African and Oriental Studies in London, but lives in southern France. He's lived with the Lemba and has written several books about them. He's found that the Lemba have many practices and traditions that are more Israelite than African.
We carried the beliefs and the practices from the past with us. And we never relinquished our practices even when we were in Africa.
Professor Magda Leroux of UNISA has also lived among the Lemba and has written a book about them. She specifically researched the Lemba's Jewish Israelite-like customs and traditions.
My main purpose was to investigate the oral traditions and to compare them with the Old Testament traditions and their customs. And it was fascinating to me to discover that their way of celebrating the new moon is even older than that of the Jewish people today. And it's interesting that the Lemba still have the pre-Talmudic way of celebrating the new moon. And that is traceable.
So, Magda believes that the Lemba have many practices that point to an ancient Israelite origin.
That has been confirmed also through our practices. The fact that we don't partake of pork, the fact that we get circumcised at a very young age, and there would be rituals which would be held immediately after circumcision, which we continue to do now. But the slaughtering, what we do is we use kosher. And the way you cut the animal, you must cut it once so that immediately it actually dies. And of course it must bleed. And bleeding has got to do with purification of the meat that you are going to eat.
All of these customs closely resemble ancient Israelite practices and have made them distinct from other black groups. Throughout history, they've been commented upon by early Arab traders centuries ago and by more recent European explorers who came into contact with them. They're also known as Kruger's Jews because as a group they had a good relationship with President Paul Kruger. They've also been called the Black Jews of Southern Africa. But how seriously can one take their oral traditions that claim they are descendants of ancient Israel who have journeyed from Jerusalem to the Yemen and then later on into Africa?
I decided to take them seriously. You know, I mean, it's difficult for our Western mind to believe those kind of things, you know, if you can't prove it. But even with proof, it's difficult for some people to believe. Nobody
believed in their story. Certainly the local Jews did not believe in their story, and most of them still do not. The whites among whom they lived didn't really believe in their story.
While there was doubt about the Lemba's claims, serious research into their practices and traditions continued. In the 1980s, their music was analyzed by Professor Margaret Nabarro, and she concluded that at some stage they had contact with the Middle East. Magda Leroux studied their cultural practices intensely for many years and concluded that they showed remarkable similarities to ancient Israel. Further indications that the Lemba indeed had contact with the Yemen, just like they had claimed, was found by Tudor Parfitt. On a trip to Yemen, he traveled with a local guide.
And I told him about my research with the Lemba and how they claim to be from a place called Senna. And he clapped his hands together and said, "I know where that is." And he brought out an ancient map of the Hadramaut. And indeed, right at the end of the Wadi, there was this place called Senna. So the next day, went with the Mukhtar in a jeep right to the end of the Wadi. We found this place. There are still people living there. And then we discovered that a whole range of local tribal names were exactly the same as the tribal names of the Lemba.
All of this was really intriguing, but
Welcome back. Thank you for joining us once again as we uncover the extraordinary story of the Lemba people, often referred to as the lost descendants of Levi, one of the 12 tribes of Israel. Found in southern Africa, the Lemba people have preserved their unique cultural identity, rich traditions, and their deep connection to ancient Jewish heritage. From their kosher-like dietary laws and spiritual burial practices to the sacred Ngoma Lungundu, their story is both captivating and inspiring. If this piques your curiosity, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you don't miss any of our future explorations. Join the conversation in the comment section and let us know if you are a Lemba and what part of Africa do you reside. Are you still practicing the Lemba traditions? Who are the Lemba? Approximately 2,500 years ago, a group of Jews left Judea and settled in Yemen. The tribe was led by the house of Buba, and we are told that this move was to facilitate trade. In Yemen, they settled in a place and built a city called Sena. The Lemba people, known as Balemba, Basena, Basoni, Vamwenye, Varemba, and Balepa, claim to be descendants of the tribe of Levi, one of the 12 tribes of Israel. The name Lemba has fascinating origins. It may come from the Swahili word kilemba, meaning turban, symbolizing those who wear turbans. Another theory links it to Lembi, meaning a respected foreigner or non-African in several Bantu languages. Some call themselves Sena or Sana, a reference to their ancestral city Sena, located in Yemen's ancient town of Sana. The journey to Africa. When conditions became unfavorable in Yemen, the house of Hamisi took over the leadership of the Lemba and led the people across into Africa. The Lemba believe that a group of about 7 men started off by marrying African women when they settled on the continent. They first settled in Ethiopia. The group grew large and eventually split into 2 groups. One group remained in Ethiopia, and the other group went further south along the east coast. They settled in what today is known as Tanzania and built Sena II. Here they prospered and increased in numbers. A small group went and settled in Malawi and Kenya. Their descendants are still residing in these countries and are generally known as Bamwenye, lords of the land. The remaining group, under the leadership of the House of Bakali, moved on and settled in Mozambique. Here they built Sena III. Even today the Basena are found in Mozambique. Part of the group, under the leadership of Seremane, moved further south to settle in Chiramba in Masvingo, Zimbabwe. They were known as the Balemba. Some of the tribe then moved south again and eventually settled in South Africa. The Lemba people are known by different names in different places where they lived and continue to live. Among the Venda-speaking people, the Lemba are known as Vahalemba or Vahashavi. Among the northern Sotos, they are known as Malepa. Among the Nguni languages, they are known as the Balemba. In Zimbabwe, among the Shona group of languages, they are known as Varemba. They are also referred to as Vamwenye or Vashavi, the Southern Africa Lemba clans. The Lemba people are divided into 12 clans similar to the 12 tribes of Israel: Buba, Hamisi, Bakali, Seremani, Tovakale, Mahani, Haji, Sadiki, Ngavi, Mange, Salefu, and Tinyaladzi. Each clan carries a distinct lineage and role within the Lemba community.
Within the past few years, extensive research has been done on the Lemba communities. These tests verify that many male black Jews have the same genetic structure as the Cohen priests, providing evidence of the relation to Jews of this ancient heritage story. Let's keep going. All right, so based on the writings of Edrisi, he was an Arab explorer of the 11th century. He adds, one finds among the black many Jewish customs. So in reference to Ghana, we are told by Reverend Christian Reindorf, a black pastor of the Basil mission on the Gold Coast about the high priest of the Accra people. He asserts a close inspection of the priest in his officiating garb leads to the conviction that his worship must be of foreign origin. One is inclined to suppose that the Jewish system of worship in the Old Testament style has been either introduced by or imitated from the people who came out first to the Gold Coast. In regards to Nigeria, G.T. Basden was for many years a missionary among the Igbo. These people live mainly in the southeastern region of modern Nigeria, though they can be found scattered throughout the entire country. Because these people are largely non-Muslim, it is likely that their ancestors were among the slaves transported to America and the West Indies. According to Basden in his book Among the Igbo of Nigeria, there are certain customs which point to Levitic influence at a more or less remote time. This is suggested in the underlying ideas concerning sacrifice and in the practice of circumcision. The language also bears several interesting parallels with Hebrew idiom. He later notes that among the Igbo people there is a distinct recognition of a supreme being, beneficent in character, who is above every other spirit, good or evil. He is believed to control all things in heaven and earth and dispenses rewards and punishments according to merit. So, looking at the picture on the right, why do we have this landmark in the United States? This is Dunbar Creek, actually. It's in St. Simon's Island, but it's the location of the mass suicide of Igbo slaves brought to the area. Is that a coincidence? Absolutely not. Why would they be using that word Igbo? Okay, so I did a video on this in 2019 sharing the oral story of the descendants from the ship the Wanderer. Be sure to check that one out. A link is in the top right. Let's keep going. So now we have to ask the question, did the United States know that they were enslaving Israelites? I have here what's called the Nixon memo. It's in the archive for the U.S. Department of State, and you can see the link where you can go and pull this up. This is a memo from Henry Kissinger to Nixon in 1969, January 28, 1969. Nixon was asking Kissinger for a report about the relief problem in Biafra, and this is what Kissinger sends to Nixon. It says, memorandum from Henry A. Kissinger, subject U.S. options in the Biafra relief. It says, you asked, this is Kissinger talking to Nixon, you asked for a study for the Biafra relief problem by of underlining the most significant parts. And it says, checked by Nixon. I'll drop down to the highlighted part where Kissinger's report to Nixon says that the Igbos are the wandering Jews of West Africa. So this report came from a colonel. He was a British trained officer, and he presided over the popular support and military morale of a people convinced that defeat means extinction. It says the Igbos are the wandering Jews of West Africa, gifted, aggressive, westernized, at best envied and resented, but mostly despised by the mass of their neighbors in the Federation. So yes, they knew, and they have known. Let's keep going. All right, it says, scholars believe there is a common origin for the Ashanti and Bantu peoples. They both came, it is thought, From the northeastern part of the continent, the Ashanti eventually migrated westward below and roughly parallel to the Sahara Desert. The Bantu moved mainly in south and southwestward directions. Today we find the Bantu peoples, a majority throughout Central Africa, and a belt extending from Zambia and Mozambique on the east coast through the Central African Republic. It says to the Congo and Angola on the west, and all of those show up in my results. The Congo, Angola, Mozambique, all of it. All right, so it goes on to say, in the Congo, Herbert Ward says there exists a remarkable affinity of certain customs to ancient Hebrew law. He notes, for example, that if adultery is committed within the village, both man and woman are considered equally guilty. Outside the village boundary, however, the man only is held at fault. Professor Keller of Yale University reports that many West African funeral customs are in the same class with the ritual sackcloth and ashes of the Old Testament. Farther south in Angola, we learn from W. Merlin Ennis that there are many indications that there was at least a common source from which arose the Hebrew culture, and that this Angolan culture arose from that. There are many place names in Palestine, and more especially in the eastern end of the Arabian Peninsula, which also was inhabited by Jews in pre-Islamic times, that resemble Bantu names. Wow. All right, it says the conclusion that most white Jews do not descend from Israelites in the racial sense is affirmed by many scholars. Professor Karl Kotsky, in his book, Are the Jews a Race?, summarizes the situation as follows. A mixed race from the start, the Jews in the course of their migrations have come into contact with a great succession of new races, and their blood has become more and more mixed. Kotsky informs us that as early as 139 BC, Jews were deported from Rome because they made proselytes in Italy. It is reported from Antioch in modern-day Turkey that the majority of the Jewish congregation in town consisted of converts to Judaism, not of Jews by birth. All right. The evidence is clearly backing up what we're saying. Let's keep going. All right. It says that Abraham and his followers were black is not only plausible in terms of our contemporary concepts of color and race, it is a fact supported by certain biblical passages and archaeological discoveries relating to that period some 4,000 years ago. The Bible, everyone agrees, serves as a source of religious inspiration for Jews as well as Christians and Muslims. More than that, it is also a source of historical information. So what is the final conclusion? They said, wherefore, we conclude that the supreme being not only of the Ashanti and allied tribes, but most probably of the whole of Negro land as well, is not the God of the Christians, which at a comparatively recent date was superimposed on the various tribal beliefs by ministers of the gospel. Sorry, folks, but it's not the man you see on the right. And don't tell me color doesn't matter. If it didn't matter, they would not have changed him. So if you're a Christian or some other religion and you're following all of this and you're asking, why is this even important? Okay, if you all are the people, everybody, for those who are saved, what difference does it make? And oftentimes that's an irritating point, particularly with Europeans, because some tend to be very dismissive of anything that pertains to our people. But why should this matter? Really, it's a valid question. Well, because this verse from 2 Chronicles 7:14 is talking to a specific people, those who are called by my name. It's not talking about every Christian. It's talking about those people. It's talking about the children of Israel. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. And then what's even more important, particularly for Christians who are just praying, hoping and praying that Messiah will hurry up and return, he told you something had to happen before he would return. And I hear many preachers say, oh, nothing else has to happen. We're in the last days. Christ can come at any time. Well, let's examine this next verse. Now take a look at this verse from Zechariah 10:9. It says, I will sow them among the peoples, and they shall remember me where? In far countries. They shall live together with their children, and they shall return. So the key is the people don't know who they are. The children of Israel have had their heritage stolen from them. Now, if you were Satan, just think about how clever that would be. It's not in Satan's best interest for the people to ever wake up to who they are and acknowledge they're wrong. So if you are a believer, if you're a Gentile, isn't it in your best interest to help the people wake up? Instead of trying to fight and disprove the evidence that is clearly there. If you really have a relationship with the Most High, and there are a lot of Gentiles who are receiving this revelation and they are saying it, they're telling their people, yeah, those people, they are the people of the book. It's in your best interest for us to wake up as a people.
The ancient inhabitants of the ancient peoples of the Middle East were all different types of black people, different groups of black people. Assyrians were a black people, Persians were black people, Elamites were black people, and Arabs, yes, were a black people. That's why you see Assyrians have depicted themselves with curly hair, curly beard, and dreadlocks. That's why you see Persians have depicted themselves with curly hair and curly beard. And even there are many wall paintings found in Susa in which Persians have depicted themselves with black skin, have painted themselves with black skin. So therefore, Persians were black people, not a so-called Indo-European, They weren't a white people. Why? Because the temperature here in this city goes up to 50 degrees Celsius in summers with a high intensity and a UV index of 12. White people cannot endure this heat. They cannot tolerate this heat. So they cannot be indigenous to this region. Because we semi-white looking people cannot stand this heat. We cannot go outside too much in summers. But how can white people be indigenous to this region? And I don't say this because I'm racist. As you can see, I'm not a black person, and I look mostly like whites than blacks. I just want to tell the truth that the ancient inhabitants of these regions, from Babylonians, Assyrians, Elamite, Persians, Jews, were all black. Please stop whitewashing history.
He gon' send his hand, destruction gotta come, that's how he get us out this lane. The devil working hard, trying to get us out his plane. His sheep hear his voice, so he can't get us out his hand. We gon' trust the son of man, blow your wings, Father. Your kingdom coming, we just trying to make it in, Father. Rather we